45 minutes. All right, let's try to do this in 45 minutes. My name is Joseph Solomon. Welcome to The Shores with Joseph Solomon. I'm your host. I don't know what to say after that. If my lips seem particularly pink today, I was trying this thing where it's like shows the plaque that's on your teeth, and then you're supposed to brush harder in those places. And I thought it would be a cool experiment. That, I do not recommend it. It has stained my lips and my tongue. I have brushed and mouthwashed with regular mouthwash, with salt water. Anyways, oftentimes, what I think is the perception of people who are quote unquote apostates, people who have left the religious faith, left Christian faith, and went on to something broader or something more material or just something else in general. They're called shipwrecked, they're called apostate. And there may be this perception that they always wanted to leave, that they were looking for an excuse to go sin, that they're angry with the church, they're angry with God, this sort of middle finger to everyone that they left behind, and that they want nothing to do with Christianity at all. A lot of those things can be true. But I think there are also a lot of people who, while as Christian, which is probably why they stayed so long, saw the real world benefits, experienced the real world benefits of being a Christian, being a religious person. They built community. They literally built families because of faith. They got married because of that. They got jobs. They're employed. They've made professions, entire careers. They've went to school and got degrees. They've made lifelong friends. And ultimately, they have made a framework of how the world works, and they've operated in that. And it helps them make sense of the world even when there's hard times like death and loss and heartbreak. There's still this framework that guides them through that. And so it makes it very difficult to leave. And when they do leave, it's much like a toxic relationship that you shouldn't be in. This person that you loved at one point, that may even you see the good in them and you enjoyed much of the time that you were with them. And yet you can't stay with them. Not just can't, you should not stay with them. And then sometimes you wish that you could have made it work somehow. That somehow y'all could have figured it out. Or maybe sometimes, as love does to people, you wish that you could have overlooked the things. Like you wish you had it. I wish I could just live with it so that I can have this thing that I want, this relationship that I want. But the healthy, aware side of you, or the aware side of you, knows that can't be. And I feel that way about Christian faith. When people sort of compress your experience down to, oh, well, if you really wanted to believe, you would. It's because you wanted to leave, because you wanted to do other things, because deep down, and then they'll even gaslight you when you say, no, that's not what I want. It's like, I know that's what you say you don't want, but the heart is wicked and was it deceitful and desperately wicked? Who can know it? Like, you don't know your own heart. You don't know. And yet they have the perception that they know your heart. It's like, well, if the heart is desperately wicked and deceitful, like, who can know? Like, well, if I don't know my own heart, what makes you think that you know? You're like, I'm telling you, that's not what you actually wanted. What you wanted was to leave, and you wanted to do this. And that may be the case for some people, that, the tension between religious conviction and guilt from sin or whatever, that they can't live with that. But I don't really think, especially in today's age, I don't think that's the common experience for a lot of people. I think people gonna sin regardless. People gonna do what they want to do. They're gonna find a way to crawl back to God and make the prayers or whatever. Like people learn how to make it work in their brain. So I don't think that's really a reasonable or a very common experience, that you would give up an entire faith just so you can go and, I don't know, do whatever it is that you wanted to do. But what I'm getting at is that, there are times I was actually writing a song. I might come out with it. And it was sparked from a conversation that I had with a loved one, a very, very close person to me. And, we don't talk about it much, but one day they decided to bring it up, and they're trying to figure out why I left, and trying to prescribe certain behaviors or reading or spiritual practices that I should have done, that I could do, or understanding and how life is much better on this side and it's so much more tumultuous on the other side of faith. And I remember telling them, I wish I could believe. Like, you don't know how much I wish that it worked, that my mind would overlook everything that I know, everything that I've experienced, everything that I've felt. That's what I was doing. I was overlooking, and I wish I could continue. I wish that there would be a switch that flips in my brain. And there were times I even prayed for that. I was like, it don't even have to make sense in the real world, but God, it would just flip the switch to give belief and help me overlook all of these incompatibilities and intellectual cognitive dissonance and all that. Like, help me just be blind to that. And sometimes I think that, there are really, really smart Christians in the world, really well-read, many that are more well-read than me. They're more articulate, and, historians, PhDs, apologists and scientists, astrophysicists, all who claim faith in Christ, and it works for them. Was part of the reason why I was hopeful that it would work for me. I was like, man, if these smart dudes can go along with it, then surely I could too. But the human mind, the human heart is I don't know if it's necessarily desperately wicked and deceitful as it is complicated, and it comes with a multitude of seen and unseen motivations for belief. And there have been times where I've thought to myself that the people who know that much, like when I have conversations with some guy and even some friends that I have, I'm like, man, you are really, really smart, bro. Like, I feel like when I talk to you, like we are working on similar cognitive wavelengths, like the critical thinking skills that you have. I feel like we on board in that sense. So do you not feel that? Do you not feel that creeping of unbelief? Like, you read the same stuff that I've read. You've gone down some of them have, some of them haven't. But they at least have that curiosity to go down that rabbit hole. It's like, have you not gone down the rabbit hole? Have you not, in attempts to learn more about the Bible and about religion, have stumbled across things that are like, this does not work, bro. It just doesn't. It don't add up. The math don't math. You don't sense that? And I think I chalk it up to, in one sense, I think people are just deeply religious, for one. You can have your sort of religious reasons for why that is, but I think there are also some very material. I think we just evolved to be very religious. I think that religion, I won't go too much to this point because it's kind of a point that I want to make later. But it's apparent that religion has been useful and helpful for the flourishing of humanity. I would never deny that. Specifically, Judeo-Christian worldview. It could be argued in some sense. A lot of the secular sort of rights and things that we champion today in a secular society could find their roots in Judeo-Christianity, Judeo-Christian worldview. I mean, even an example would be that it really wasn't until the Reformation, beginning with, in some sense, somewhat attributed to Martin Luther penning that 95 Theses on that door and sort of launching this revolution against the Roman Catholic Church, and which sparks a whole chain of events, like having the Bible readily available to the public, where it used to be only readily available to those who are worthy enough, those who are in charge, the elite, the theologians and whatever, the priests and all that. And it sparks this sort of chain of events where now it's not simply your relationship to the group that ties you to God, which some would argue that the Bible has always sort of argued that, but it wasn't really realized as this sort of personal relationship. It was not always a given, a granted thing within mainstream Christianity that your relationship to the divine was a very personal thing versus a thing that you were born into, a family or a nation, or submitting to the church, the Catholic Church, but rather it's not the church that has the power to deem you forgiven or unforgiven, or you can't pay nobody to get a. And from that flows a shift from social identity or group identity that moves more into individualism. And now we're in a very hyper individualistic society. But it could be argued that in some sense, and with a lot of other factors as well, but one of those factors of how we got to the, well, my truth is my truth, and my relationship to the divine is my relationship to the divine. Who's to tell me that I'm wrong? Who's to tell me that I'm right? Which we enjoy in a secular society, finds its roots, a pathway in some sense, at least for the West, and sort of broad culture across the world. We can find roots of that in Judeo-Christianity, and among other things that Christians have brought to the world. So, yes, it is useful. Makes me think of, I actually took some notes on this too. I don't know how to pronounce her name. I only read it. A friend of mine, Ruslan, sent me this article a couple of months back. A woman I had not heard of prior to this, and apparently I should have known about her, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I'm not really sure. I know I'm saying the Ali part right. I'm not sure about the other names. But to give some backstory on her, she is, I believe, a 50-something-year-old woman who was raised in very devout Muslim family, and she grew up Muslim, and then fast forward somewhere in the early 2000s, she renounces that Muslim faith and becomes an atheist. To her own account, it seems as if she attributes at least a significant part of that to Bertrand, article that she read from Bertrand Russell, titled "Why I'm Not a Christian," and so she goes on her own sort of journey of sharing the ills of Islam and how bad it is for global society and how bad it is for women and etc. And apparently I heard somewhere as well that there was this idea that the four horsemen of the new atheism, which would be Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Dawkins, and I forget the other guy's name now. But she was going to be the fourth, apparently, the four horsemen or whatever of, I don't know what that is. But very notable person in this space. I had not heard of her. I've heard of Richard Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris. I had never heard of her before. And she writes an article saying why she is now a Christian. This got published at the end of 2023. And I found that quite intriguing because she is a 50-something-year-old woman. And people don't typically make such massive changes in their worldview that late in their life. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all. It's just more common that you find that large shift, somewhere in the 20s and maybe even 30s. Especially in the college space, and maybe even younger now because of social media, TikTok, Instagram, just the widespread of information out there, whether true or false information. It's so widespread that these ideas are germinating, pollinating each other, and you're getting people bumping up against worldviews that they weren't raised in quite often and quite early. So for someone who was not raised in that era, at least in her sort of formative years, to make that type of decision so late in life, and the fact that she was known, that she found space and community and even identity, I would argue, prestige, notability in atheist spaces, to then renounce that was intriguing to me. And I'm just interested in that conversation sometimes with, and I was interested in what she had to say. I'm not exactly sure why Ruslan decided. I forget why he sent that to me. I'm sure it was part of a conversation we were having around it. And so I decided to read it. And then I was a little disappointed. I was a little disappointed as to why she's a Christian now. She says, why I'm a Christian. She wrote the article. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I don't disagree with her in a lot of the points that she's making. I just don't see how she got to the conclusion. Let me point out some of the things that she says. I wrote it down here. Some of her points, and I've just kind of paraphrased or summarized them. This is her reasoning for going from atheism to Christianity. She says, well, one, Western civilization is under threat from communism, Islamism, and woke ideology. So she kind of groups communism and authoritarianism from like Russia and China. The Western civilization is under threat from ideologies like this, as well as Islamism in the East, in the Middle East, and then woke ideology. As soon as she said woke ideology, I was like, oh, here we go. Let me just say, I don't know how, I don't like that conservative evangelicals hijacked that word and blew it up. It was our word. It was black people's word, and they don't even use it the way that we used it. Woke, oh my gosh. Like now it's like, it's a pejorative now, but woke really just meant being aware of what's going on, the systems that are at play here. And from that general definition, which I believe that's how we always, are you woke, stay woke, bro. Like pay attention to what's going on around you. It didn't mean all the very specific things that they now use as pejorative terms, but it just meant, be awake. You sleep, don't sleep, bro. And under that definition, you'd think that everyone would want to, and to some degree, even conservatives are trying to be woke in that sense. In that definition, it's like they're trying to pick, there's some systems at play. There's some, there's some CRT at play. There's, the whatever. I don't know. They're being, in the general definition, they're being woke too. Like that's the whole point of the word. I hate, but so when she said woke ideology, I was like, oh, okay. Here we go. I don't know much about her, but I was like, she's found some solace in some interesting circles. But to her credit, I will say that there are, and I won't get into this video, but I do believe that there are some extreme versions of leftist ideology, progressivism, that do undermine intellectual honesty, that could possibly undermine religious freedom, that in extreme forms do give pause and concern to what they may lead to if carried out to their furthest conclusions over a course of a few decades. But I just don't like that the woke ideology sort of envelops a lot of really helpful ways to see the world and to look at the world and to call out injustice and hypocrisy and real systems that are harmful to human life. So anyways, woke ideology, Islamism, communism are threats. And then she says that, well, if these are the threats, what are the tools that we're using to combat that? And she says secular tools like technology, military, and money are inadequate responses. Inadequate, I don't know why I said like inadequate responses. Inadequate technology, military are inadequate responses to ideology. So military and money and technology are all physical things. And I think what she's sort of getting at is that communism, Islamism, woke ideology are not physical things. And so therefore they can permeate in a much different way. You cannot, as maybe some Christians will argue, man, the weapons of this warfare are not physical. They are ideological. Fair. And then what she goes on to say is that apparently secular freedoms of the market, apparent secular freedoms, and she says apparent, meaning that they're not actually secular, but they are apparently secular, freedoms of the freedom of the market, freedom of human conscience or freedom of human speech, and freedom of the press are rooted in Christian ideals. I won't go into details. I hinted at it earlier. I really don't have it. It depends on where she, we can have debates about the history of that and what she exactly means by that. But in general, I have no pushback on that. Sure, yeah. They can be found and rooted in Christian ideals. Moreover, these things have not and could not thrive in communist or Islamic nation states. And I'm assuming that maybe we can also believe that they ultimately will not thrive in woke ideology, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of the market cannot thrive in a woke society. Won't take time to fully disagree or agree. I can see where that lands. Okay, so again, I'm not having huge qualms with what she's saying is my point. And she says that what we need is not money or military or technology to push back against this, but we need a unifying story. Something I've said this in my previous videos. I'm talking about life without meaning. And I've sort of brushed up against this in other videos that I've talked about as well. I keep bringing this up, this need for narrative. And I believe that religion is one of the greatest narratives that humans have ever come up with, a grand unifying narrative I agree with her. I agree that stories are good. Stories unify people, particularly religious ones, but all kinds of stories. The story of a football team, the story of a comic character, the story of historic figures like a Malcolm X, the stories of whatever. We tell ourselves stories of our nation so that we can have a unifying story about we are American. To say that is a story. When you say that, I'm suggesting a story behind that when I say I'm proud to be an American. These are myths. They're stories that tie obviously connected and seemingly disconnected points together, and we form an identity up under that narrative. And she says that Christianity is best suited for that. And again, I see the beauty of Judeo-Christian faith. I have a lot of critiques about Christianity, and I enjoy what Christianity has done for me, what it's done for my family, and in many ways what Christianity has done to the West and to America. The advances and eras that we've gone through because of the freedom that Judeo-Christian worldviews and thoughts have sort of propagated. I'm fully on board with, and I can see the usefulness of it, but I don't see how you get to, and this is why it was disappointing, she never got to, was truth. Like she literally, like, that's kind of like the end of her. You can go read the article, I'll link it. You read it and it's like, there's never any claim to truth. It's like, this is why I'm a Christian now, is because I've found that the atheist worldview is intellectually untenable, and the Christian worldview I found to be historically accurate and true and gives it the best description of reality, and it makes sense and all that, and this is how. Nothing. And all that is very debatable. It's been highly debated for whatever, since the dawn of writing and thought, right? Or maybe not that far back, but still, like, we've been debating the existence of God and the validity of Christianity for a very, very long time. And the fact that someone like her, of her intellectual aptitude, would leave that part out was quite interesting to me, because what it sounded like is not that she believed in a resurrected Jesus, that she was making claims to the validity or historicity of the Bible, but rather that Christianity is useful. Which I have no qualms with. Christianity clearly is useful for a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. It was useful for slavery. It was useful for misogyny. It's useful for crusades. It's useful for a lot of negative things, but it's also useful for a lot of good things. As I've hinted at already, I've spoken about before, like, I won't try to act like that's not true. I've even just heard of, I may want to read this book. There's a book about an atheist of why religion is good for the world. I got to find the title of it. That's the hard part, is that, as I've said before, truthfulness is not the same thing as usefulness. Usefulness is not the same thing as truthfulness. And that's the tension that a lot of people don't want to exist in. I don't want to exist here, which is why I'm never really trying to push people off their religious horses. Because I do see the beauty and usefulness of not just Christianity in the social sphere, but even in private and individual lives, spiritual practices, the routines that you can get from being a devout believer, the joy that you get from prayer, and the solace and the peace of knowing that someone is in control when things seem so chaotic, when you feel so little in the universe, to know that the God who created it has you on his heart every day, is a very useful idea to have in your front pocket. It just doesn't make it truthful. And I use that same sort of pushback when people talk about morality. That kind of came up in the comment section in my last video, where they were like, okay, well, how do you find morality? Who's to say that murder or genocide or XYZ is wrong if there's no God who says that it is wrong? Again, you're not making an argument for truthfulness. You're making an argument for usefulness. It would be convenient if we had someone to say, see, this is, life makes more sense when we say there is a universal cosmic moral value, moral standard. And if we were left to relativism, that could possibly lead us into nihilism. It can not give us a sturdy foundation for human society, for flourishing. And we say we value human lives. Where do we get that idea from? And again, it all sounds like you're making the argument for the usefulness of Christianity, as Miss Ali was doing here, which is kind of crazy to me. But it leads me back to my original point, is that I don't deny the usefulness of Christianity, which is why I wish I could believe. And maybe that's what Miss Ali is getting as well. Maybe she doesn't actually believe, because she kind of suggested in her article that, like, I still have a lot to learn about it. And I have not heard anything about her faith since then. Granted, it's only been a couple of months. But I'm interested to see where that goes. Does it lead to actual faith? Which, do I have time to talk about this? Let me just throw this point in here real quick. When Christians see someone leave the Christian faith, the most obvious, most common and frequent pushback that I've received, and a lot of my other apostate friends have received as well, is like, oh, you were never a Christian to begin with. They question the validity of your Christian experience. And maybe I need to make a whole nother video addressing that. But I noticed that it's never asked in reverse, which is why it seems so disingenuous to me. It's only asked when it's going opposite of their faith values. But if it's someone coming to the Christian faith, they're never like, oh, you dropped that entire worldview that was based on Islam, your Islamic worldview, you dropped that. That means you were never actually a Muslim. No one ever says that. No one ever says, oh, they were never actually a Christian. They were never actually a Muslim. They were always a Christian. They were always a Christian. They just didn't know it. All right? They never say that about that. Or if they say, oh, I was an atheist and now I'm a Christian. No one says, you were never an atheist. If you ever left it, then you never were an atheist. You were always a Christian. And yet, in reverse, it's like, oh, you were... They do it. They say, oh, you were never actually a Christian. You never actually held those beliefs truly. And no matter what reasoning you give or experience you give, like, no, this was so true to me. It doesn't matter if it didn't last, then it wasn't true. But they don't use it. It only works because they have certain scriptures that say that. But functionally, practically, and philosophically, it's extremely inconsistent. Extremely inconsistent. And no one asked that about Miss Ali, about whether or not she actually was a Muslim. This woman went from Muslim to atheist to Christian. And no one's like, oh, she was never actually a Muslim when she was a Muslim, or she was never actually an atheist. No, that woman was really a Muslim. She really believed in Allah. That woman really was an atheist, really believed there was no God. But maybe there's another type of gaslighting argument that could come along with that too. Like, oh no, see, she actually always knew there was a God. She was just suppressing it in her unrighteousness. But what about now? Now that she's a Christian, she's claiming to be a Christian. Y'all don't readily receive people who come, fair enough, when they say they're a Christian, they're like, well, we got to see the fruits or whatever, and we'll see, where this goes. And then maybe in a year or two's time, they're like, oh, she probably is a Christian. Well, we'll just see. But they don't say that about people who left Christian faith. They're just like, oh, as soon as they made that announcement, there's no sort of seeing. It's no sort of like, well, we'll just see how this thing plays out. Nah. So I think that's quite interesting. But in any case, there is, as I'm making all these conversations around sort of, a lot of it feels sort of maybe heady or intellectual or just making logical statements or whatever, but ideas have emotional consequences too. And what I was sort of suggesting at the beginning of this video, when saying that, it's not everyone who leaves Christian faith that they somehow don't want anything to do with it anymore. They don't see the good in it at all. They got anger towards God and the church or whatever. That's not always the case. And with those intellectual ideas that they come across, they always have emotional consequences, whether good or bad. And I think even if you can find it in your own worldview as a Christian, as a believer, I think it can be very unloving to dismiss that experience, one, as it never really was existed at all, and two, that it was purely intellectual and cold and arrogant, or purely emotional, but rather that it could be that they made an intellectual decision that came with a very deeply emotional experience. And it is tough to be like, I know that I could never go back. I couldn't. As much as I see the value, particularly because I was going to make a video about masculinity post-Christianity, that's what sort of made me want to make this video first. I see, when I think about the men who have influenced me in the way that I've constructed what I value in masculinity, though I have a lot of pushback, a ton of pushback to how masculinity was presented to me in the church, whether it be as a child or as an adult. And I mean in a doctrinal sense, in a sort of propositional sense. But as far as a lived functional sense, what I saw with my own eyes, whether it be my father or the elders in the church that played a huge part in raising me, my children's church ministers, all the way up to my young adult pastors, and then the men that I became so close to in Bible study, in small group, and we confessed our sins to one another. We cried with each other. We rejoiced with one another in our triumphs in life, and we mourned through our struggles. And I saw real men who exemplified people that I want to be like. They exemplified a masculinity that I wanted to be like. And a lot of that was not only prescribed to them by Christianity, but motivated by Christianity. That it's not just say, this is how you need to be a man, but also the motivation comes from the Bible to actually want to live up to that ideal. The motivation comes from this worldview that it all has an eternal consequence. And I admire, when I wrote down on my board, I'm writing down on my dry erase board all the time. And one of the things I was writing down, like, is I'm trying to figure out masculinity in a new space. Not that I haven't figured it out, but just like, what do I own and what do I let go? And I write down the men that I've deeply admired over the years, whether I knew them well or I knew them kind of. I wrote down the qualities that I felt like they all had in common. And one of those things is they go to church. they believe in a higher power. They belong to a religious organization. They serve a religious organization. And there's something very forming and fortifying about religious faith, particularly for men in this context, but obviously just for humanity in general, for children, for women, and for men and women who do not fit in your traditional gender roles, but still find fortitude in their identity in a religious power. So I see the beauty of it, and in many ways aspire to be like these men who have inspired me. And the tension is, I wish I could believe what y'all believed. I wish I could. In other ways, I also kind of wish I was like, man, I wish if I can say this without sounding condescending, if it comes off condescending, I do apologize. But it's said to me often that people sort of pity where I'm at now. They pity me not having faith in God. And I'm like, I also have pity for others as well. I do have pity in some sense for those who are religious. The things that they submit themselves to unnecessarily. So it's both sides. And some may see that as, somebody wrote in the comment section, they not just once, but several times when they hear me talk, they're like, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. It's like, life is complicated. And I don't want any pretense of acting like it can all be black and white, whether you're religious or not. If you just act like it's all cut and dry, then you've somehow covered your ears in some ways or covered your eyes. The Bible says, if you go with me now to Ecclesiastes, it says that he who increases in knowledge increases in sorrow. Some translations will say he who increases in wisdom increases in sorrow. The more you learn, the more complicated this life you learn it is. And that can, to some people come off as double-minded, but I see it as nuance and trying to be emotionally and intellectually honest with this journey that I'm in. And I suggest it to all. It's, the unexamined life is not worth living, as a famous philosopher once said. And I want to examine that life, and I want to live a life that is worthwhile, whatever that means in the grand scheme of things. And that comes with wrestling with things like, I see the good. And in some ways, I wish I could. But unfortunately for me, it can't just be useful. It must also be truthful. Did it under 45 minutes. Did we record it? We did record it. Perfect.